Hello and welcome, everyone. When Fred West met young Rosemary Letts in the late 1960s, they shared a common dream: to get married and start a family. But behind their appearance as perfectly ordinary people, well integrated into society, the couple led a sordid double life, one devoid of morality, filled with sexual deviance, abductions, torture, and murder. It would take the police nearly 2 decades to finally uncover their criminal past. In today's case, I invite you to discover with me the story of Fred and Rose West, those whom the British press would later nickname the Evil Ones. Please note, some parts of this story may be disturbing to listeners. It is therefore not recommended for a young audience. February 1994, Gloucester, United Kingdom. We are at 25 Cromwell Street, a small suburban neighborhood in the town of Gloucester, in the southwest of England. Since early morning, police cars and ambulances have been arriving in convoys. The area is cordoned off, and the neighbors, shaken, are gathered around, stunned by what they are seeing and hearing. Bodies have been discovered in the garden of one of the houses. The news hits Cromwell Street like a bombshell, especially because the searched house belongs to a very respectable couple, Fred and Rose West. People well liked in the neighborhood. She is a homemaker. He works in construction. Since they moved here, the neighbors have only known them as the parents of 10 children, with Fred working hard to provide for his family and Rose described as kind, loving, and a model mother. Seeing both of them taken away under tight police escort, heads down and hands cuffed, each placed in a separate police car, leaves the community in complete shock. And yet the chilling story of Fred and Rose West doesn't begin in February 1994. It began many years earlier. A deeply disturbing and extraordinary story, and today I'm going to tell it to you. To do that, we need to go back in time. Frederick West, known as Fred, was born in 1941 into a modest family in Hertfordshire. He grew up in a rural setting, surrounded by many siblings in conditions of extreme poverty. During wartime, life for the West family and others like them was a nightmare. German bombers roared across the skies, food was rationed, and medicines and basic goods were scarce. This was the harsh daily reality for these poor families. The English countryside had never seemed so bleak, so desolate. At the West farm, none of the children went to school. They all worked. The father, Stephen, was a violent, domineering man, while the mother, Daisy, was a cruel and overbearing woman. They were the very image of a dysfunctional family long before the term existed. The West parents were simply devoid of any moral compass. Hidden away from the world in that isolated farmhouse, they ruled like tyrants, more like jailers than parents. From a very young age, Fred West and his siblings were exposed to disturbing behavior. Their father taught the boys to commit incest with their sisters, claiming it was completely natural and ideal initiation for marriage. But that wasn't all. From that point on, Fred's life followed a pattern of instability. After being forced to leave Bristol, he drifted from job to job, always on the move, always under suspicion. It was during this unsettled time that he met Rosemary Letts. She was only 15. Fred was nearly a decade older, and their meeting would change everything. He was 17 when a serious motorcycle accident left him in a coma for several weeks. The accident left him with physical scars and a wobbly gait. The psychological after effects are even more serious, though completely invisible. But as time goes by, Fred becomes moody, incoherent, and prone to violent, unpredictable outbursts of anger. By the time he begins to discover women, he already hates them, and his vision of them is very disturbing. For him, a healthy, loving relationship is impossible. He is, however, obsessed with sex. With the advent and democratization of pornographic magazines, the young man collects photos featuring libertine practices. In post-war England, in the midst of an economic upheaval, everything had to be rebuilt. Gifted in manual labor, resilient and strengthened by years spent charcoal burning on the family farm, Fred finds a job as a bricklayer in Bristol and sets off to settle there. But even there, trouble is never far away. Accused of raping a 13-year-old girl, he manages to get off the hook thanks to his lawyer, who declares him epileptic. Clearly, despite his young age, he has already acquired a reputation as a sexual predator and filled his criminal record. As a result of this incident, he is fired from his job and has to move again. Gloucester, 1967. The late 1960s marked a turning point in history. England was slowly freeing itself from old traditions and preparing to enter the cultural revolution of the 1970s. Followed later, by the social unrest of the Thatcher years. It had been 3 years since Fred West left Scotland to return home. For the past few months, he'd been working as a construction laborer on the site of a new shopping center. In the evenings, he'd go alone to the pub, drinking beer and watching the young women who came to sit at the bar. The red-faced family men, fellow laborers like him, sipping lukewarm beer and burping without shame, filled him with disgust. They reminded him bitterly of his own status. He watched them from the corner of his eye as they compared dog race results, proudly flashing their sauce-stained betting slips, before erupting into loud commentary on the football match playing on the pub's television. Their thick Cockney accents, typical of England's working class, echoed throughout the room. The next morning early, he gulped down a cup of tea and splashed cold water on his face in the kitchen sink. He grabbed his satchel, slipped on his coat, and headed toward the bus stop to get to work. In this March fog, the town was blanketed in a cold, damp mist. The bus arrived. Fred climbed on, showed his pass to the driver, and found an empty seat. It was a good 30-minute ride to the construction site. Around him, some passengers dozed off, others read the paper or casually smoked cigarettes. They were all heading to the same destination, factories and building sites. That's when Fred noticed a young girl sitting across the aisle. She was alone. Boldly, he stood up and approached her. "Hello, miss. Mind if I sit here?" The girl mumbled something and nodded yes. Fred stretched out his long legs and squeezed past a woman to sit by the window. He smiled at the girl. She looked away, shy. A little Miss Prim, probably a Catholic, he thought, eyeing her up and down without the slightest shame. Jet black hair, thick glasses, a small round face, and sad eyes matching the color of her hair. She wears a buttoned jacquard coat, a yellow scarf, and clutches a leather bag tightly against her chest. "What's your name?" Fred asked kindly. "Rose? Didn't quite catch that?" "Rosemary," she repeats, slightly flustered. "I'm Fred West. Nice to meet you, Rose," he says with confidence, flashing a wide smile. She doesn't blush, but eventually gives a faint smile and looks him in the eye. He's not handsome. In fact, he's rather unattractive with curly hair, sharp cheekbones, narrow eyes, a wide nose, and poorly maintained teeth. Not to mention the scars all over his face. He must have done time, she thinks. Fred notices her staring at his scars. Casually, he runs a hand over his cheek and says, with mock nonchalance, "Oh, that? Bike accident when I was younger. Just a reminder of my stitches." She barely whispers, "I'm sorry," then lowers her gaze to her shoes. And yet, despite the scars and his lack of charm, there's something magnetic about him, a persuasive energy in the way he speaks that leaves an impression, as it had with many others before her. "Cheltenham, next stop," announces the recorded voice. "I'm getting off here," he says. "Let me see you again tomorrow, all right?" Her dark eyes, magnified by her thick glasses, fix on him with a sudden sparkle. "All right," Rose replies more confidently this time. When they met on that bus, it was an accident waiting to happen, a perfect storm. Excerpt from Rose West's biography. "We'll always be together. I want you to come live with me," Fred tells her on their first date. Rose was much younger than him, only 15, while Fred was 27. It wasn't a classic love at first sight, but something powerful, almost visceral, formed between them instantly. Rosemary Pauline Letts was born on November 29, 1953, in Northampton. She was the fifth child of a working-class couple. Her father, William, was violent and mentally unstable, suffering from a severe form of schizophrenia. He frequently abused his wife and children, creating a climate of fear in the household. Like the man courting her, Rose grew up in a toxic environment, a withdrawn, dysfunctional family where disturbing behavior was normalized and moral boundaries had long since disappeared. From an early age, she was regularly abused by both her father and uncle. Her mother, timid and emotionally absent, did nothing to protect her, preferring to look the other way rather than confront the horrors happening under her own roof. As she grew older, Rose developed a hypersexualized attitude, despite her quiet appearance and angelic face. It was a coping mechanism, a way to navigate the distorted world she had been born into. She had learned to see as normal things that clearly were not. The attraction between her and Fred West is immediate. Their unhappy and troubled childhoods, their abnormal families, their chaotic backgrounds contribute enormously to this emotional closeness. In 1970, barely a year after their first meeting, the couple moved into a small house on the outskirts of Gloucester, at 25 Cromwell Street. At the same time, Fred gets his daughter-in-law Charmaine to come and live with them. Rose accepts the little girl's arrival without retaliation. She herself is expecting a happy event. But behind the walls of this house, strange things are happening. Everything in the couple's life is based on sex, and nothing else. Fred, who plays Pygmalion to his little wife, soon realizes that his preference for violent, deviant sexual practices doesn't shock her. Quite the contrary. Although initially influenced by her husband, Rose soon reveals herself to be just as lecherous and libertine as he, quickly becoming an active and enthusiastic sexual partner. Translated with deepl.com free version, their relationship turns into a kind of sadistic partnership, where each feeds the other's impulses. In cases like this, it's hard to speak of love. The birth of a baby girl named Heather in 1971 did nothing to alter their toxic dynamic. 7 or 8 more children followed, the best known being 2 more girls, May and Louise, and a boy, Stephen. However, it's impossible to know the exact number of the couple's children, as they are so numerous, and sometimes even biracial, as in the case of 2 mixed-race boys that Rose West is said to have had with a Jamaican man. Rose, who grew up in a family where values were completely turned upside down, reproduces the same pattern with the family she founded with Fred. Her childhood and youth, marked by a certain isolation and repeated sexual abuse, mean that she has neither the aptitude nor the tools to integrate into society. Despite the omnipresent violence in the house, Fred and Rose manage to maintain a semblance of normalcy as soon as they step outside. Nothing at first glance seems to distinguish this couple from the others. They raise their children, organize garden barbecues and birthday parties, and interact with their neighbors without arousing suspicion. Fred, in particular, is always trying to get people to like him, in a rather false and awkward way. He laughs, takes things lightly, but never manages to be convincing. When he notices that the person he's talking to isn't impressed by his attitude, he immediately stops the comedy, withdraws into himself, and shows the true side of his personality, a dark, evil side. His stratagem, however, is crowned with success with some emotionally needy, self-confident women. West simply smiles at them and compliments them on their appearance, so that they fall for the trap. In January 1972, Fred was caught stealing from a lingerie store and sentenced to 3 months in prison. Left alone with her newborn baby and 8-year-old Charmaine, Rose became increasingly irritated by the latter's presence. The child is regularly beaten by her stepmother, starved, and forced to sleep on the kitchen floor in the middle of winter. But there's more to Rose West's cruelty than that. In the end, she strangles the little girl and hides her body in the basement of the house. When Fred is released, she tells him what happened. Without saying a word, he moves the corpse to a trap door in the garden. The murder of little Charmaine turns the West's life upside down in a monstrous way. In the early 80s, the couple shift into high gear. It begins when Fred suggests that his wife prostitute herself in his presence to satisfy his voyeuristic urges. It was in their house on Cromwell Street that the couple began to commit their first murders in pairs. What if we offered girls free accommodation in exchange for babysitting, for example? Rose suggests. Together, they drew up, with macabre efficiency, all the details of the procedure to be followed to trap future candidates. A sinister modus operandi consisting of luring young women, often by taking them into their homes, only to torture, sexually assault, and kill them. The future victims are mostly working class, from dysfunctional families, young women who have run away from foster homes or their parents, girls with nowhere to turn, penniless, completely lost and vulnerable, ideal targets. It has to be said, too, that by this time, the couple had reversed roles somewhat. Whereas Fred used to be the dominant figure, it's now his wife who pulls the strings in this sordid and horrifying game. On a fairly regular basis, husband and wife take the car and drive around the city's bus stops. The fact that they act as a couple goes a long way towards deceiving their victims. The presence of a woman, in this case Rose, reassures them. Sometimes they go so far as to have one of their youngest children accompany them, sitting on their knees. Potential victims are easy to spot. You can see them standing a little way back, looking thoughtful, never accompanied. Their backpacks on the ground to rest their shoulders, their fingers blackened by rolled tobacco, their hair dirty and unkempt. It was at this moment that Mrs. West took action. Dressed in her coat, her handbag slung over her arm, she approaches the girl first. Meanwhile, her husband, seated behind the wheel, observes the scene with an air of satisfaction, unable to stop himself from wincing with pleasure. Rose has a certain talent for approaching girls, a natural way of engaging them in conversation. She expresses herself in a soft, pleasant voice that would make even the most wary person flinch. A scene she's rehearsed so well, she plays it over and over again to perfection. Fred saw his wife approaching the car, followed by the somewhat intimidated young girl. As he settled into the passenger seat, Rose gave him a knowing look, then drove off in his friendliest voice, looking in the rearview mirror. Nice to meet you, Lucy. I'm sure you'll feel right at home with us, and I hope you enjoy the company of children because we've got a dozen of them. Haha. As soon as she arrives at her destination and the door of the house closes on her, things start to happen. Disoriented, the victim sees the couple, who had been so affable and pleasant, metamorphosed before her eyes, now ogling her like a common piece of meat. One thing leads to another. She's beaten by Fred, pushed into the basement, stripped of her clothes, tied up and kept in the dark, then raped in turn by Rose and Fred, and finally killed. The couple's crimes are extremely cruel, and they stop at nothing. The bodies are later dismembered and buried in the house. As a construction worker, Fred has the necessary skills to conceal the human remains beneath the ground. Encouraged by this first attempt, the couple now devote all their spare time to this horrifying hunt, following a similar pattern: sequestration, torture, rape, murder, then hiding the bodies. The crimes grew out of all proportion throughout the 80s. At the same time, they don't just trap and kill strangers. Their own families were also victims of their sadism. The children they have together suffer constant physical and psychological abuse. Fred is obsessed with incest and encourages his wife to participate in the sexual abuse of their offspring. Heather, the eldest, who is quite pretty, is unaware that she is already in her parents' crosshairs. Soon she's their favorite target and their favorite whipping boy. Then one day, when she can't take it any longer, Heather threatens to go and tell the police all about it. Fred and Rose decide to eliminate her. In 1987, they killed their daughter and buried her under the checkered terrace. She joined the many other bodies buried in the garden of their Cromwell Street home. To their other children, they declare, "If any of you try to do like Heather, you know where you'll end up, buried under the garden patio." This would become the couple's favorite threat. Heather West's disappearance initially went unnoticed because Fred and Rose told neighbors in her school that she had moved away. But as years passed, neighbors began to question this. A girl her age would have at least come back once for family holidays. Fred and Rose West remained free for years, partly because of their skill at hiding their crimes, but also because, although some found their behavior suspicious, it never raised enough alarm to trigger a full investigation. However, in February 1994, the situation changed. It started when one of their daughters, 13-year-old Louise, confided in a school friend about the abuse she was suffering at home. Just 2 days earlier, she had been assaulted multiple times by her father. When she complained to her mother, Rose responded, "You asked for it." Her friend had the good sense to report this to a police officer directing traffic near their school that same day. An investigation was immediately opened, and it quickly took a darker turn. On February 24, 1994, alongside Louise's statements, another inquiry began concerning her older sister Heather, who had mysteriously disappeared in 1987. When questioned, Fred claimed he had nothing to hide. "I don't know where she went. When her mother and I found out she was a lesbian, she decided to run off abroad with her girlfriend. Since then, we haven't heard from her. My wife hasn't slept a wink since." Heather was 16 at the time and did not have a passport to leave the UK. Fred's overly sorrowful attitude, combined with Rose's silence and sly glances, left the police with a bad feeling, raising strong suspicions that they had killed their daughter. 2 days later, Gloucester police obtained a search warrant to dig up the garden. "Yes, you can search, gentlemen, but make sure to put everything back in order when you leave," the tormentor said, running out of arguments. For 5 days, officers excavated various spots around the house. In the basement and garden, about 1.5 meters underground, police found overwhelming evidence confirming what many had long suspected. Fred and Rose were serial killers. The discovery included a disturbing assortment of human remains, mostly bones, some dating back 20 years. On the final day of the search, a total of 12 bodies were uncovered in and around the West home. Later, more remains were found in places where Fred had previously lived. The news spread quickly, plunging the residents of Cromwell Street into a state of utter shock. It had happened right in their neighborhood, and no one had ever noticed anything. Fred was always seen as a friendly, approachable, and helpful man to his neighbors. Rose, a true angel, so kind to the children, so sweet, so caring. The parade of ambulances carrying stretchers to the morgue was a horrifying sight. Some of the human remains dated back to the early 1970s, the period when the couple had just moved into the neighborhood. At that time, nearly 10,000 women were reported missing across Great Britain. The police were preparing to undertake painstaking work to determine whether any of these missing women were victims of the West. For the forensic experts, the challenge was another matter entirely. The absence of skin, muscles, and organs, those that might indicate illness or injury, made examination extremely difficult. The fact that most bodies had been buried underground for nearly 2 decades complicated the determination of causes of death. The only way to get answers was through dental records. This method helped identify several victims, including Allison Chambers, killed by Fred West in August 1979 at the age of 16, Linda Goff, a nanny and former tenant of the couple. Her mother later recounted that when she once knocked on the West door to inquire about her daughter, Rose greeted her at the doorstep and claimed not to know where Linda was. When the mother glanced down, she noticed Rose was wearing her daughter's slippers. Shirley Robinson, a young woman who was pregnant with Fred's child at the time of her disappearance. Lucy Partington, a 21-year-old student abducted while waiting for a bus to go home. Among the hitchhikers, there were Carol Ann Cooper, Teresa Siegenthaler, and Juanita Mott. Heather West, who had disappeared since 1987, was also on the list. Confronted with the evidence, Fred was arrested at the end of February 1994, followed by Rose 2 months later on April 20th. Both were held on remand. Rose, who had previously requested bail, had her application denied and was sent to Puckle Prison in the maximum security wing reserved for dangerous inmates. On April 25th, she confessed to the rape and murder of Linda Goff. During interrogations, Fred showed strange behavior, sometimes charming, sometimes joking, but failed to impress Inspector Leo Goatley, who was questioning him. Eventually, Fred began to confess, declaring himself ready to take full responsibility for the crimes. He tried to protect Rose by insisting she had no part in the murders. "I killed Anne McFall, my former mistress when I was still in Glasgow, as well as my ex-partner, Catherine Costello, the mother of my daughter. I buried their bodies in a field at Much Markle, not far from the Hertfordshire farm where I grew up." Fred West's story kept changing constantly. At first, he admitted the crimes, then denied them, later claiming all deaths were accidental and asking to be charged with manslaughter instead. Rose also retracted her statements. Although she had confessed to the murder of Linda Goff, she later denied any involvement, despite mounting evidence against her. She maintained a cold and impassive demeanor throughout. The only time she broke down was when the officer mentioned her daughter Heather. Rose burst into tears and cried for hours. Throughout the trial, she held firm, placing all responsibility on her husband and criminal partner. On June 30th, 1994, the couple appeared before the Gloucestershire Crown Court. It was the first time they saw each other since their arrest. Fred was charged with 12 murders, Rose with 9. During the trial, one of the most sensational and closely followed in modern British history, Fred repeatedly tried to reach for Rose's hand without success. She, on the other hand, chose to adopt the role of the grieving mother who had lost her beloved daughter, allegedly murdered by her monstrous husband. This image was widely portrayed by the British press at the time a Mater Dolorosa, seemingly ready to repent. Their verdict was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a predictable outcome despite the crowd outside the court chanting in unison, "Death to them." Fred West was held at Birmingham Prison, where he fell into deep depression. On January 1st, 1995, Fred West was found dead in his cell. Taking advantage of a lapse in suicide watch, he had fashioned a noose from a bedsheet stolen from the prison laundry. He left a farewell note with a drawing of a gravestone. "In memory of Frederick West, rest in peace where no shadow falls. In perfect peace he waits for Rose, his beloved wife." Rose West is still serving her sentence in Puckle High Security Prison. She is now 71 years old. The story of the Gloucester Diabolicals is both difficult to grasp and deeply disturbing. It is clear that both were psychopaths, completely lacking empathy. Their dynamic was particularly perverse. Fred seemed to dominate Rose at first, but over time she became as violent as him. if not more. Their case shook the UK profoundly, not only because of the horror of their crimes, but also because they evaded justice for decades. People still wonder how they could operate for so long with impunity, despite several warning signs from those around them in social services. Mae West, the couple's youngest daughter, spoke to the press for the first time in 2018. Now married and a mother of two, she has hidden from her children the identity of their grandparents, living in fear they might someday discover the truth. She says, "Sometimes when criminals are arrested, people forget their families. When I see cases in the news, I always wonder, what happened to the children?" Forced to live with this heavy family legacy, Mae West is barred from working in certain professions, especially those involving children. She cannot travel freely and is banned from entering the United States and Australia. She expresses her outrage. "Why did the police turn a blind eye to the abuse my siblings and I suffered for all those years, only to then stigmatize us because of what our parents did? We are victims just like everyone else." The film Appropriate Adult, released in 2011, is loosely based on the story of Fred and Rose West. Ironically, the actor who played Fred shares the last name West in real life. The house at 25 Cromwell Street, nicknamed by the British press as the House of Horror, was completely demolished in October 1996, and its furniture destroyed to erase the horror from collective memory. Since then, the site has been redeveloped as a public walkway.